The vengeful heart, a girl's fury against men. The wind howled through the broken windows. The room was cold, dark, heavy with silence. Her breath was shallow, her fingers trembling, her pulse loud in her ears, thudding, steady, like a warning. She glanced around the dim room. The walls seemed to close in. The shadows stretched, twisted. Her eyes darted. There. A figure stood in the corner. She hadn't seen him enter, but there he was. Her heart skipped, throbbing in her chest. A familiar face. A mask of a smile. But it was wrong. That smile. It never reached his eyes. Her hands shook as she reached for the knife. Cold steel against her skin. It had been with her for so long. Her only companion. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt the weight of it. The weight of everything. The years of rage. The betrayal. She stepped forward. Each movement slow, deliberate. The room seemed to tilt. To spin. The man didn't move. Didn't speak. Just watched her. A predator's gaze. Her feet were numb against the cold floor. The silence crushed her. Every step felt heavier. The air thick with something dangerous. Closer. Closer. Her chest tightened. A bead of sweat trickled down her neck. She reached out. The knife gleamed in the dim light. It felt like the only thing that could save her. The only thing that mattered. Suddenly, the man laughed. A low, mocking chuckle. It echoed through the room. Grating. The sound made her freeze. Her grip faltered. The knife trembled in her hand. He stepped forward. A slow, purposeful stride. Every movement calculated. Her breath was ragged now. Her heart racing. Pounding. He was too close. Too close. She could smell him. The scent of smoke. Of cologne. Of sweat. He reached out. His hand brushing against her cheek. The coldness of his touch. Her whole body tensed. Her skin crawled. The knife. It was too late. The door creaked. A slow, haunting sound. She didn't turn. Her eyes never left him. The body on the floor. Lifeless. Footsteps. Soft. Almost inaudible. She felt a presence behind her. Someone entering the room. Her chest tightened. Her grip on the knife remained steady. But her heart was racing again. She didn't need to look. She knew who it was. The footsteps grew closer. The air thickened. Heavy. A voice, low and familiar. Did you do it? Her throat tightened. A dry lump forming there. The room seemed to shrink. The shadows gathering again. She nodded, but her mouth was dry. Her voice caught. Yes. It came out as a whisper. Another step. Closer. The cold breath on her neck. Are you sure? The voice asked, calm. Too calm. Her skin prickled. Her heart beat louder. Thud. 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 She forced her gaze to the floor. The blood pooling beneath his body. A whisper of movement. Something behind her. A shift in the air. She didn't want to turn. She couldn't. The figures stopped. She could feel them watching. Like they were reading her. What's wrong? The voice asked again, softer. More insistent. She clenched the knife tighter. Her knuckles white. Her head swimming. She couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. The voice behind her grew darker. Do you even know what you've done? The question echoed. The words sinking deep into her chest. A cold sweat ran down her back. Her stomach churned. The room was still. Dead still. Then, the voice changed. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was another. A deeper tone. You're just like him now. Her breath caught. Her stomach twisted. She turned slowly. The world around her spun. The figure behind her. It wasn't who she expected. It wasn't who she thought. Her eyes widened. Her knees buckled. There, standing in the doorway, was a mirror. A reflection. Her own face staring back at her. And the truth, the cold truth, settled over her like ice. She wasn't free. She had become him. Her breath caught in her throat. The reflection in the mirror was too much. Her own eyes. Her own face. But something darker. Her hands trembled. The knife still gripped tightly, blood dripping from the blade. She took a step back, then another. But the reflection didn't move. It stayed there, staring, judging. A pit formed in her stomach, a cold, hollow feeling. The silence was suffocating. She couldn't tear her eyes away. Was this her? Was this what she had become? Her thoughts swirled. The rage, the fury, the years of pain. Had she really won? Had she really freed herself? The mirror didn't lie. It never did. She staggered toward it, her hand outstretched, fingers trembling, reaching for her own reflection. But the image in the glass shifted. It twisted. The face in the mirror grinned. Her stomach dropped. Her heart raced. The figure in the glass wasn't just her. It was something more, something worse. A low laugh echoed from the mirror. It wasn't her voice. It wasn't even human. Her eyes widened. She stumbled back. "No," she whispered. But the reflection only laughed louder. A deep, guttural sound. The face in the glass began to change. It was still hers, but it was distorted, malicious. She clutched her chest, her breath shallow, her vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt, the walls pressing in. She couldn't breathe. Her throat tightened. The reflection leaned forward. Closer, closer. A whisper. Too late. The mirror cracked. A sharp, jagged line splitting the glass. Her reflection, it grinned wider, its eyes gleaming with malice. She stumbled back, the walls closing in. Her knees hit the floor. The world spun. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The laughter from the mirror echoed, filling the room, filling her mind. And then, the world went dark. Everything stopped. In the silence, nothing moved, nothing breathed. The room was still, the air, heavy with the weight of something broken. Her mind was a haze, a fog that clouded everything. But somewhere, deep inside, she could feel it, a sharp, aching pull. She opened her eyes. The darkness was thick, impenetrable. Her hands were cold, her body stiff. But she could move. She pushed herself up, her limbs trembling, her chest heaving with each shallow breath. She looked around. The room was empty. The mirror was gone. The blood had vanished. The body, too. It was as if it had never been there, as if nothing had ever happened. But the feeling lingered. The echo of that laugh. The reflection. She stumbled forward, her fingers brushing against the walls. Every step felt wrong, like she was moving through a dream or a nightmare. Her heart thudded in her chest. Loud. Unrelenting. She could still hear it. That voice. The one that had whispered in her ear. The one that had laughed. "You're just like him now." She shook her head. No. It wasn't possible. She wasn't like him. She couldn't be. She reached the door, her fingers curling around the handle. It felt cold. Too cold. The air outside was thick. The scent of rain, of earth, of something long buried. She stepped outside. The world was different. Shifting. Unreal. The streets were empty. The houses dark. It felt like a place that wasn't hers. A world she no longer understood. Her eyes darted around. The silence felt oppressive. Then, the faintest sound. Footsteps behind her. She turned quickly. Nothing. But the air was heavy with something. Something she couldn't name. She started walking. Faster now. Her feet pounding the ground. But no matter how fast she moved, it felt like she wasn't getting anywhere. The footsteps, they were always there. Closer. She broke into a run. Her breath ragged. The city, the world, it felt like a trap. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew she would never escape. The footsteps followed, unyielding. No matter how fast she ran, they were always there. Her breath came in gasps. Her legs burned. Her vision blurred. The streets stretched endlessly. Nothing but empty buildings. Empty windows. Dark, vacant. The sound of her footsteps echoed, but something else mixed with it. A low, heavy thud. It wasn't just behind her now. It was all around. She stopped. Frozen. A chill ran down her spine. Her heart pounded in her ears. The air felt thick. The darkness closing in. She turned, her eyes scanning the shadows. But nothing moved. She took a step forward. Then another. But every step seemed wrong. The ground felt unstable beneath her feet. Her thoughts were a blur. Rage. Fear. Confusion. She glanced back. Still, no one was there. But the footsteps continued. Closer. Closer. She couldn't take it anymore. She spun around, yelling into the silence. Who's there? The world held its breath. Then a voice. Barely a whisper. Run. Her pulse skipped. The voice was familiar. Cold. But she couldn't place it. It echoed through her mind. Like an old memory. Too far gone to reach. She began to run again. Faster. Desperate. Her feet pounded the ground. Her chest tightened with every breath. She passed alleyways. Darkened doors. Windows. All staring back at her. The footsteps. They were everywhere now. Surrounding her. Closing in. She dared not look back. She could feel it. The presence. And then a sharp pain. A cold hand on her shoulder. She froze. A chill shot through her body. It pulled her back. Her feet lifting from the ground. A voice, familiar yet foreign, whispered in her ear. You can never outrun yourself. Her heart stopped. She turned slowly. And there, standing behind her, was her reflection again. But this time, it was real. Her face, twisted with something dark. Something monstrous. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Her breath shallow. Stuck in her throat. The reflection grinned. A cruel, triumphant smile. And before she could move, before she could scream, it reached out. A cold, suffocating grip, tightening around her chest. Her vision blurred. The world spun. And in the darkness, the laughter returned. The grip tightened. Cold fingers digging into her skin. Suffocating her. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her chest felt like it was caving in. The world around her spun. Faster. Faster. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. Her throat was tight, clogged with terror. The reflection, that twisted, mocking version of herself, hovered before her, its grin widening. It didn't speak, just watched, as if savoring every moment. She struggled, desperate, her hands clawing at the air. But the more she fought, the tighter the grip became. Her limbs went numb. Her head spun. In that moment, she felt something snap, a breaking inside her. She closed her eyes. Tears stung her skin. But still, the reflection loomed. The laughter echoed. Louder now. Closer. The world was slipping away. Darkness swallowed her whole. For a second, a fleeting moment, she thought she saw it. A flash of light. A door opening. A distant, familiar voice. Come back. But it was too late. Her vision blacked out completely. And then, nothing. The silence was crushing. Empty. She didn't know how long it lasted. Minutes? Hours? Days? But when she opened her eyes again, she was no longer running. No longer struggling. She was standing. In the middle of the street. It was still dark. But something had changed. The world felt different now. She didn't feel the cold anymore. Or the fear. There was only emptiness. Her heart, once racing with terror, was still. The footsteps had stopped. The reflection was gone. But something lingered. A presence. An undeniable weight. She looked around. The world was still. No footsteps. No shadow. And then the voice. That cold, mocking whisper. So this is it. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. She knew now. She was always alone. The reflection had never left her. It had always been inside. And as the silence stretched, she understood. There was no escape. Not from herself. The air grew heavy again. Thick with something she couldn't name. Her pulse, steady now, still thudded in her chest. She stood frozen, her feet rooted to the cold ground, Her hands, trembling slightly, felt the weight of the knife once more. She glanced down. The blood was still there, staining her fingers, staining her soul. The streets stretched out in front of her, empty, desolate. No cars, no people, only her, and the weight of everything she had done. The voice returned, a whisper carried on the wind. "Do you feel it?" She flinched. The voice was both inside and out, echoing, repeating, "Do you feel what you've become?" She squeezed her eyes shut. Tight. Tighter. The darkness behind her eyelids was the same as the darkness around her. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape the truth. The reflection had been right. It was always her. Always. Her chest tightened again. Her breath came in shallow gasps. "Stop," she whispered, but the words felt hollow, swallowed by the emptiness. Her fingers tightened around the hilt of the knife, cold steel pressing into her palm. It was all she had left. But for the first time, it didn't feel like salvation. It felt like a lie. Her legs shook. Her mind spun. And the voice. It was relentless. "You can't outrun what's inside you." She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the empty street. Was there anyone else? Was there anyone left? But the shadows didn't move. The world didn't change. It was all the same. It had always been the same. The laughter echoed once more. Low. Dark. Her heart hammered in her chest. She clenched her teeth. The knife in her hand. It felt heavier now. "Run," the voice murmured, as if it were a command. A final, desperate plea. She stood there, motionless, the world holding its breath. And, in that moment, she understood. There was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. It was all inside her. Always had been. She was the reflection. She was the darkness. And there was no escape from herself. Her breath was ragged now, her chest tightening with every inhale. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. The world around her stood still, silent, waiting. The weight of the knife in her hand grew heavier, almost unbearable. Her fingers burned from gripping it so tightly. The laughter, that low, guttural sound, slithered around her like a shadow. It seemed to crawl beneath her skin. She stared at the knife. It was cold, shiny, but no longer a weapon. It was just a thing, a useless thing. She raised it slightly, examining the reflection in the steel. Her face, her eyes. But they weren't hers anymore. They were the reflections. That twisted, broken version of herself. The voice again, so close now, whispering in her ear. "You can never run from what you are." Her breath caught, the weight of those words pressing down on her chest. The world felt unreal, like she was trapped in some cruel dream, a nightmare that wouldn't end. She blinked, once, twice, trying to shake it off. But it didn't work. The reality she had built, the life, the revenge, the hate, it was all crumbling, falling apart in her hands. She could feel it now, the numbness creeping into her soul. Every step she had taken had led her here, to this moment, to this reflection. She wasn't free. She had never been free. The silence stretched on, broken only by the beating of her heart. For a long time, she just stood there, frozen. Her mind screamed at her to move, to fight, to run. But her body didn't respond. Her eyes glazed over. The knife, still in her hand, felt foreign now. She had become the monster she swore to destroy. The laughter came again, louder now, deeper. It wasn't just in her ear anymore. It was in her mind, in her bones. Her knees buckled. She dropped the knife. It clattered against the ground, shattering the silence. Her chest heaved. Her body trembled. And then the voice came again, not in a whisper, but in a slow, mocking chant. "You're just like them." Her hands gripped her head, the pressure unbearable. The words reverberated in her skull. "No," she screamed, but it was pointless. The voice only laughed louder. The world around her twisted. It blurred and shifted. And then, with a final, deafening crack. Everything went black. Darkness swallowed her whole. The blackness stretched endless. No sound, no light, just the pounding in her head. Throbbing. Constant. Her body felt heavy, like it was sinking, disappearing into the void. But then a flicker. A tiny spark of light, far in the distance. She reached for it, tried to move, but her limbs felt like stone. Paralyzed. The pounding in her chest grew louder. Faster. Faster. The light flickered again. Closer now. A voice. Low. Familiar. Come back, it whispered. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Her fingers twitched. A small movement. Barely noticeable, but it was enough. Just enough. She took a step forward, her feet dragging through the darkness. The voice was louder now. Urgent. Pulling her closer. You're not alone. The ground beneath her shifted. It felt unstable, like walking on water. Each step uncertain. The voice came again. So close now. It felt like it was inside her skull. Do you remember? The memory hit her like a wave. A flood of images. A face. A hand reaching out. A soft voice. Her breath caught. She knew that voice. She had heard it before. Her heart skipped. It was the voice of her mother. But it felt distant, as if she were hearing it from another lifetime. The darkness began to pull away. The world shifting. Slowly, her surroundings started to take form. Shapes emerged from the void. Shadows and light. And then she saw it. A figure standing just ahead. A silhouette in the dark. It was her, but different. Older. Wiser. Her reflection. Not the twisted version from before, but the one she had forgotten. Her real self. The figure raised its hand. A gentle, inviting gesture. She hesitated. Doubt lingered in her chest. But then, with a shaky breath, she stepped forward. Closer. And the figure smiled. A smile of understanding. Of forgiveness. And for the first time, she felt something stir inside her. Something soft. Something healing. The weight in her chest began to lift. The suffocating darkness faded. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was free. The voice of her mother whispered once more, "You're not alone." And this time, she believed it. The darkness continued to recede, slowly, like fog lifting at dawn. The figure before her, her true reflection, stood in the soft glow, waiting. She could feel the warmth now. Not the cold emptiness that had consumed her, but something real. Her heart was slowing. The frantic pounding had eased. She stepped forward. The ground beneath her firm now. Steady. Her feet light. Her body no longer heavy. The air was crisp, fresh, clean. She looked up, meeting the gaze of the figure. It was herself, but wiser. Kinder. The reflection smiled again. A gentle, knowing smile. "You've come far," it said. Its voice calm, soothing. Not the whisper of shadows, but a voice full of warmth. She swallowed, her throat raw from all the screams, the silence, the years of rage that had choked her. I didn't know how to stop," she whispered, her voice fragile. The reflection nodded, its eyes full of understanding. "You didn't have to stop." The words hung in the air, soft yet piercing. She felt them deep in her chest, like a burden finally lifted. "You only needed to forgive." Her breath caught. Forgiveness? She glanced down, her hands still trembling slightly. But this time it was different. The blood was gone. The knife was gone. She looked back at her reflection, and for the first time, she saw herself as she truly was. Not a monster, not a victim, but a person. A person who could heal. The figure took a step closer, closing the space between them. "You've carried too much. For too long," the reflection whispered. The words were like a balm, soothing the ache that had lived inside her for years. "You can let it go," the figure said. And as it spoke, the weight of the past, the anger, the violence, it began to fade. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough for her to breathe again. She nodded slowly, unsure, but hopeful. The reflection extended its hand. This time, it wasn't a gesture of threat or judgment, but an invitation. She hesitated, but her fingers, shaking at first, reached out. Their hands met, and when they touched, the world around her shifted once again. The darkness dissolved. The light grew stronger. Her reflection smiled, this time with pride. "You're free," it said, its voice warm and steady. The weight in her chest was gone. The world no longer felt like a cage. She wasn't running anymore. Not from herself. Not from the past. She stood there, in the light, with her reflection, her true self. And for the first time in forever, she felt whole. The light around her was brighter now, softer, almost like a sunrise after a long, stormy night. Her reflection, still holding her hand, no longer seemed distant. It felt familiar, comforting. The weight she had carried for so long, all the pain, the anger, the guilt, it had melted away, fading into the air like mist in the morning sun. She could breathe deeply now, without that tightness in her chest. The hollow space was filled with peace. She glanced around. The world looked different, more vibrant, more alive. The streets she had once run through, chaotic, empty, oppressive, were now calm, almost serene. The buildings no longer felt suffocating. They stood as part of the landscape, just like everything else. Her footsteps, light and steady, carried her forward, her reflection still by her side, like a constant, steadying presence. "Where are we going?" she asked softly, not sure if it was a real question, or just a whisper of curiosity. Her reflection smiled, a peaceful smile, no longer mocking or twisted. "We're not going anywhere," it replied gently. "We're here." The words resonated deep within her, like a bell ringing clear and true. She didn't need to run anymore. She didn't need to escape. She was already where she was meant to be. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt the truth settle into her bones. She was enough. The past, the darkness, it was all a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had faced it, embraced it, and now she could let it go. Her reflection stepped forward, and for the first time, she saw the light in her own eyes. Not fear, not anger, but something else. Acceptance. "You're not alone," the reflection whispered again. But this time, it didn't feel like an empty reassurance. It felt like a promise. Her lips parted. She wasn't sure if she would speak, or if she even needed to. But the words came anyway. Soft, steady, almost sacred. "I forgive you." The reflection nodded, its eyes full of love. And as it did, the world around her seemed to bloom. Colors brightened. The sky, once dark and heavy, shifted into a soft blue. The weight that had pulled her down, the rage that had driven her, faded into the distance. And for the first time, she felt the true meaning of freedom, not from the past, but from herself. Her reflection smiled, and she finally smiled back. In the distance, a new dawn had broken. The sun rose slowly, casting long, golden beams across the landscape. The world seemed to breathe with her. A deep, steady inhale, then a quiet exhale. For a moment, it was as if everything had paused. The air tasted fresh, alive. Her reflection, still by her side, didn't speak. It didn't need to. The silence was enough. She stood there, facing the horizon, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. There were no more questions, no more doubts, just the stillness of being. The road ahead stretched out before her, long and open. Her footsteps were light now, free of the burden she had carried for so long. As she walked, she felt the memories of the past, the rage, the grief, the fear, begin to dissolve. Not erased, but softened, like water smoothing rough stone. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. that she was simply walking, living. The wind rustled through the trees, whispering a song of new beginnings. And with each step, she felt herself becoming more whole. Her reflection walked beside her, no longer separate, no longer something to fear. It was just her. For the first time, she felt at peace with who she was, with what she had been, and who she would become. The road was uncertain, but that no longer frightened her. It was simply a path, and she would walk it, one step at a time. She didn't need to rush. She didn't need to know the end. She only needed to be present. In the moment, the past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. And as she continued to walk, the sun rising higher in the sky, she understood that the true freedom was not in escaping, it was in accepting. And in that acceptance, she was whole. The world stretched out before her, wide and open, endless. And she stepped forward. The wind was cold now, biting at her skin as she stepped further into the night. The world was dim, the stars barely visible behind a blanket of clouds. She felt it again, the familiar weight, the hunger, a gnawing at her soul that had never quite gone away. Her footsteps echoed in the empty street. No one else was around. The city was silent, its heartbeat muted. She paused, looking around. The shadows seemed deeper tonight, as if they were alive, following her every move. She felt it, the pull, the call of the past, whispering to her from the darkness. She shook her head, trying to push it away, but it lingered, like a thick fog. You can't outrun it. A voice whispered from the shadows. Her breath caught. She didn't need to turn around. She knew that voice. It was hers, but twisted. The reflection. Her heart skipped a beat. It had been so quiet for so long, but now it was back, and it was louder than ever. Her hands clenched into fists. She wasn't ready to face it again. Not after everything she had fought through. Not after all the time she had spent trying to forget. But the voice didn't stop. It circled around her. A persistent whisper. A mocking laugh. You can't escape what you are. You know it's true. She took a step forward. The wind howled, like an animal hungry for flesh. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the darkness. Not of the reflection. But as she moved, she realized something. It wasn't the world she feared. It was herself. The past wasn't gone. It had never left. And deep down she knew, no matter how far she ran, no matter how hard she fought, she would always carry it. The reflection wasn't something she could defeat. It was something she had to learn to live with. Her footsteps slowed, the weight of the truth settling in. And this time, she didn't turn back. She simply walked forward, into the unknown, knowing she would never escape it. But maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to live alongside it. The street was quiet now, the hum of the city distant, like a memory fading with each passing second. She stood at the edge of the empty road, the cool night air wrapping around her. Silent and heavy. The weight of the past, the rage, the pain. It still lingered, but it felt distant now. For the first time, she wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She had stopped trying to outrun herself. The path before her wasn't clear, but she knew now. There was no perfect end, no moment of triumph, no final confrontation. It was just life. Imperfect, uncertain, but hers to live. The reflection had shown her the truth, that she couldn't escape what had shaped her, that the darkness was a part of her, and always would be, but she didn't need to fight it anymore. She had spent so long trying to tear it out, to destroy it, to bury it beneath 1,000 layers of anger and fear. But now, as she stood in the quiet, she understood something. The darkness was not the enemy. It was simply a shadow. And she was the light. A smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Tired but genuine. She looked up at the sky, the stars just beginning to peek through the clouds. It wasn't perfect. The world wasn't perfect. But it was hers. She took a step forward, slowly, with no urgency, just a steady pace. Each movement felt deliberate, a choice, not a reaction. The street stretched on, and with each step, the weight of the past grew lighter. There was no victory, no final moment of release, but there was peace, and that was enough. She didn't need to know what came next, because for the first time, she was content in the journey. Her heart no longer raced, her breath no longer caught. She was simply alive, and that, she realized, was the greatest freedom of all. With one last quiet breath, she let the night carry her forward, into whatever came next.